Hi, I'm Dan, and welcome to Polar Currency and video number 49, World War II USA Currency, video 1 of a two-part series. The second video will cover what the Allied and Axis powers issued for currency. This video, it's been an idea for over a year for me, but I just couldn't formulate what I wanted it to be. A lot of people already know what the US issued for currency during World War II, and to be honest, beyond the basic facts, there really isn't a lot more to the story. But there is a lot more to the story of currency during World War II as a whole, and I've found a few more nuggets. The U.S. Treasury Department and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing certainly issued more than just emergency banknotes. We've certainly all heard President Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous speech to Congress declaring war on Japan. Japan's preemptive bombing of Pearl Harbor, the headquarters base of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet, wasn't its only attack. Pearl Harbor was only one piece of a much larger coordinated attack on multiple Allied Asian Pacific targets by the Japanese Empire. On the same day as the Pearl Harbor bombing, Japan attacked the U.S. territories of Guam, the Philippines, and the British territories of Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, and Thailand. Japan eventually invaded and occupied all of these areas and remained in control until the final year of the war. The U.S. entry into World War II brought forward a very busy time for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the BEP. The first thing the Treasury Department had to figure out is how to pay for the war. The Second World War cost the United States over $300 billion. That's $5.3 trillion today. The federal budget went from $9 billion in 1940 to over $90 billion in 1945. How was the nation to pay for that? There were multiple questions, some answers, but they all needed to happen very fast. First off, federal income taxes were increased with an additional 5% victory tax. On June 10, 1943, the government approved the first automatic deduction of taxes from paychecks. But more was needed, and the government turned to bonds, which had been effective in World War I. War bonds were sold at 75% of face value. A $100 bond sold for $75, and then matured over 10 years. While the rate of return was below market value, bonds were a stable investment with the bonus of aiding the war effort. Channeling cash into bond purchases helped prevent inflation in the robust wartime economy as well. The BEP produced multiple types of war bonds, and they were issued even after the war. The Treasury began in 1942 having the BEP make savings bonds that were very large. They were later made much smaller. Both were issued in $10 through $1,000 denominations, so there were multiple price points and affordable to all. There were even special defense bond stamp album booklets. You could purchase $18.75 of special war bond savings stamps, fill up the booklet, and redeem it for a $25 savings bond. These were aimed at children to get them involved and also were another lower price point. I mean, look at this. To hold this history in my hands with actual stamps in there, it's just cool. Short sidebar. Occasionally I send out a preview of my videos asking for feedback. Well, I sent a sneak peek over to Dean at Massapequa Gold and Silver, and he pointed out that the eagle on the front of the defense stamp album is the same eagle used on the reverse of the Series 1918 Federal Reserve banknote. I mean, that's the green eagle. I never noticed. It took a coin guy to point it out to me. I'm a little embarrassed, but sometimes you can't see the forest through the trees. Thanks, Dean. End of sidebar. I have to take a World War II civilian sidebar. This is kind of personal for me, so bear with me. Even in a small meatpacking and farming town that was at least 1,000 miles from any ocean, civilians' lives were affected. My maternal grandfather, Carol Plager, was an air raid warden. I have his Minnesota Civil Defense ID card, his air raid warden handbook, his Minnesota Manual of Blackout Procedure, his air raid warden cap, and the armband to go with it. He didn't serve in the armed forces because of dependency, and his occupation was considered essential to the war efforts. That ticked him off, so he became an air warden and did what he could. The small town is Austin, Minnesota, which is where both my parents grew up. and to this day it's the headquarters of Hormel Foods, the makers of Spam, which has its own World War II story. Spam, which is officially an acronym for Specially Produced American Meat. Although Grandpa always said that Spam came from putting the words spare and ham together, I believe him because he worked for Hormel for 40 years and was an actual employee when Spam first came out in 1937. Spam became a vital source of food for Allied fighting forces, the countries that they liberated, and U.S. civilians. It was a cheap meat product. I'm proud to say my grandfather was an employee of Hormel during World War II and that he was an air raid warden in the middle of nowhere that was never going to have any planes fly over from the enemies. It may sound funny, but just a sidebar to the sidebar, he was inducted into several pork industry Hall of Fames. The guy knew his pigs. Thanks for bearing with me. I just wanted to share that. End of sidebar and back to currency. The BEP produced a commemorative $200 war bond issued in memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in October of 1945. Heavens to Murgatroyd if they ever made a banknote that was a commemorative. Anyways, FDR had recently died in April of 1945. By the end of the war, 85 million Americans, out of a population of over 130 million, had purchased $185 billion worth of war bonds. That's over $2,000 per person at a time when the average income was, guess what, about $2,000 a year. The patriotism and personal sacrifice of the average citizen played a significant part in the U.S. war effort. The BEPs still had their normal work to do, producing postage stamps, which, because of the war, the amount of mail being sent drastically increased. In addition, paper money still had to be printed. With the economy turning around because of wartime production, paper currency was in very high demand. The BEP even released a stockpile of $29 million of 1929 small-size Federal Reserve banknotes, FRBNs, in December of 1942 that had been sitting in the Treasury vault since 1935. If you want to know more about that, check out my video, Small-Size 1929 FRBNs, in the link below. But the war brought on additional special requirements for the BEP. According to the book, Bureau of Printing and Engraving, The First 100 Years, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japan was a viable threat to invade the Hawaiian Islands. The Treasury decided to withdraw all standard U.S. currency from the territory of Hawaii and replace it with a special issue of notes exclusive to the islands. The Department of War and Treasury Department deemed this action necessary as an economic defense for Hawaii. The notes are comprised of the $1 silver certificate and the $5, $10, and $20 Federal Reserve notes issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. The designs were identical to standard currency, but the blue and green Treasury seal and serial numbers were printed in a brown ink. In addition, the front of the notes were overprinted with Hawaii in black bold type at both ends of each note, and the reverse was overprinted with large skeleton letters, Hawaii. The order was received June 8, 1942, and they were ready in July. No other currency types could be used in Hawaii except the brown seal overprints after August 15, 1942. It was also prohibited to export the notes to the mainland. On October 21, 1944, the Treasury Department terminated the economic controls and no further Hawaiian overprint notes were made, but the remaining notes were permitted to circulate right along with the other 4 U.S. currency types. You heard me right. Yeah, 4. You had the regular legal tender notes, silver certificates, Federal Reserve notes, and remember those FRBNs? In all, more than 66 million Hawaiian notes were issued, totaling $411 million. The Hawaii overprint $1 silver certificate brown seal ranks number 65 in the 100 Greatest American Currency Notes by Q. David Bowers and David M. Sunman. A second World War II emergency currency was needed for another theater of war and produced the same month as the Hawaii overprints. With the U.S. participating in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa that was occupied by the Italian and German armies, there was a need for currency that was similar to the Hawaiian notes. So this time the Treasury Department directed the BEP to produce special silver certificates with a yellow Treasury seal, not gold, but yellow, replacing the normal blue. These notes were issued in $1, $5, and $10 denominations. The 5 and 10 are stunning notes combining the bright yellow seal on the right with the decorative blue denomination on the left. They're two of my favorite small-size U.S. notes. Just over 65 million yellow seal silver certificates were issued with a face value north of $323 million. There was much less risk of Germany, let alone Italy, invading the U.S., so there wasn't as many restrictions regarding the use of North African notes stateside. The BEP stopped production of the yellow seals again in early 1944 when they began producing Allied occupation currency. More on that later. Error sidebar here. I'm sure I'm not the first person to find this out, but I'm pretty sure there's an error in the book 100 Greatest American Currency Notes. It states that there's also a $20 yellow sealed silver certificate that was issued. Check it out on page 106. And while we're here, the $1 silver certificate ranks number 77. I've never heard anything about a 20 North Africa yellow seal. The Hawaii Federal Reserve overprint notes did have a 20. But the 20 is not listed in the Paper Money of the United States book or any other U.S. currency book that I have. Always good to have multiple sources of information. End of sidebar. Both series became known as emergency currency issues serving three purposes. The first being that they could easily be demonetized if the Axis powers ever gained control over them. The second was armed forces personnel needed to get paid. Those serving in the Pacific Theater were paid in Hawaiian notes, and those in Africa and for a short time in Italy were paid with the yellow seals. Military payment certificates would not be around until 1946. There was also a need for currency within the new territory that the Allied forces occupied. Many territories occupied by the Axis powers issued their own occupation currency or had a puppet-controlled government do so. And when the Axis powers knew they were about to lose territory, they attempted to create hyperinflation within the local economy before retreating. So a stable currency was needed. Federal Reserve notes and silver certificates weren't the only form of U.S. currency to change. The change, and I guess the pun is intended, was the result of the metal content of two U.S. coins that were altered as a result of the copper shortage during 1943. The 1 cent was produced with steel with a zinc coating. I have to admit that the coin stands out and it's fun to find in change on a rare occasion. The Jefferson nickel, only 4 years old by 1943, had its metal content changed from 75% copper and 25% nickel to 56% copper, 9% manganese, and 35% silver was added to the coin in place of nickel. What's more interesting about wartime nickels is that they contained 0 nickel. To identify the nickels produced with metal content change, the U.S. Mint put mint marks on all of the 5-cent coins, and for the first time ever, the letter P for Philadelphia was used as a mint mark. You also didn't need a loop to see them. And since I already had 2 of the World War II coins, I figure I might as well complete the set with the dime, quarter, and half dollar. Which, by the way, takes a hefty jump in price at grade 65. The coins are now part of my World War II money collection. Time for an ironic moment to think about for silver stackers. In 1943, the U.S. government and the entire war manufacturing industry determined that copper and nickel were more essential and more valuable to the war effort than silver that's stacked today. So, will silver ever hit $50 an ounce? Don't get me wrong, silver is beautiful and I love a good chunk of numismatic silver in hand, but I still find it very ironic. Of course, you think we're done, but we're not. There was another wartime, very specific currency issued in the U.S. between 1942 and 1946, but it was only issued to the 425,000 German, Italian, and even some Japanese prisoners of war that were held at over 700 POW camps in 46 states. Why did prisoners of war have a need for money? Well, POWs were allowed to work on non-military tasks such as farming, construction, and manufacturing. They didn't have to work, but they did get paid if they did. Rather than creating a unified payment system, most camps issued their own currency tickets called chits that came in booklets prepared under contract by private printers. They were paid on a scale based on the U.S. equivalent of their military rank. When the war was over, now the former POWs received a check in the amount of the balance of their account. This was not paid out in U.S. currency. The POW received Allied military currency denominated in the currency of the prisoner's home country. Have to admit, I was amazed to learn that there were at least 20 POW camps in Minnesota. All of the camps in Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Iowa were managed by one main base camp in Algona, Iowa, that at one time housed 10,000 POWs in that location. Camp Algona was just 35 miles south of the Minnesota border. Today, Algona is a town of 5,000 people. Go Bulldogs! Here's something a bit odd added to the U.S. World War II currency story. In the spring of 1944, the BEP was asked to run a test using $1 silver certificates. In June. Anybody remember what was happening during World War II in June of 1944? Regardless, what has become known as the RS experimental test took place in June of 1944. According to the 1962 book, The Bureau of Engraving and Printing, 100 Years, it states that the R was for regular and the S was for special. The special had nothing to do with the content of the paper, but, quoting the book, had special chemical features. From the November-December Society of Paper Money Collectors bi-monthly journal article, author Jamie Yakes writes that the special paper was quoted with 1.5% melamine resin and 1% titanium dioxide. On June 14, 1944, over 1.8 million notes of each type were produced and printed with the RNS and shipped to the Federal Reserve District of Chicago, where they were released. The experiment lasted nearly 2 years, during which the Treasury received only 114,000 R notes and 95,000 S notes. Less than 10%, that basically rendered the experiment inconclusive. The public was the determining factor. Fascinated by the novelty of the red and S notes, they were saved in droves. You'd think someone would have thought of that at the BEP. The RS test shouldn't be confused with earlier tests. According to the book Standard Guide to Small-Size U.S. Paper Money, 10th edition, there was a previous test done in 1933 with 1928A and 1928B silver certificates that did involve paper. There were test notes produced using paper that varied the amounts of cotton and linen. And according to a PMG 2015 website article, a test was done on Series 1935 silver certificates that had 3 control groups for a special finish, a special paper, and regular paper. Both the 1928 AB and 1935 $1 silver certificate tests were tracked by serial number block letter numbers. All 3 tests didn't produce results to make any changes. There's a lot more to what the U.S. issued for currency. Beginning in 1942, the U.S. Treasury and the BEP began printing currency for the world at war, specifically Allied military currency, or AMCs. That story begins in the second part of this video series, World War II Axis and Allied currency, so come on back to see what was issued and why. That's it for video number 49. As always, I appreciate your time. Please take the time to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you have, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Also, if you like what you see, hit the thumbs up button, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for checking in.